Welcome to the FRCL Weekly Call. We're a group of distribution leads who get together regularly to discuss works in progress, share ideas, and create opportunities for cross-distro collaboration.
All right. Hi, everybody. It is March 18th. We are Fedora RHEL and CentOS leads talking about things of mutual interest. Normally, that's a technical nature or a strategic nature. Today, it's more of just a logistical nature. We need to check in and see how are we doing as a group? Are we working in the right way? Because my sense is that we have been doing this for enough weeks now that we've probably noticed a few patterns of things that we like and a few patterns of things that we don't like. And so overall, I'd like us to kind of talk about what's working well and what needs work so that we can create a sort of social contract. This might just be thought of as a bit of documentation for how we want to show up here, what we're trying to accomplish, because just because I have this intro doesn't mean that's necessarily why you're here. And so I wanted to open it up with the things that you're thinking about. So if you are on the calendar invite, you'll see there's a link to the agenda, and you can follow this and add links. I just put a few notes in here to provoke discussion if needed, but I would just like to open up the floor and ask people what's working well for you and what needs work at this point in time. Let's use hands. All right, I'll do the first one. So one thing that is working well, I feel like, is that we have good dialogues. We like talk about real and important things. But one thing that I think needs a little bit of work is that most of the topics are coming from Red Hatters that are kind of sharing out, and there's not a lot coming in initially, as far as I can tell or remember, from Fedora CentOS leads. And I don't know why that is, if it's because we're just like beating you to the punch, or if you don't feel like you're welcome, or things of that nature. So that's one thing that's working well. Like the conversation's working well, but the things that we are covering, maybe it's not coming from enough diverse sources. So I'd love to see some hands about this, and stop sharing my screen so I can see you better. Scott, what do you think?
Well, to contribute to your problem of ideas coming from Red Hatters, I'll raise my hand first. No, I agree with that exactly. I was gonna say what's working. I feel like that meeting we had when we talked about like what shared problems we all want to go after together, like everybody got excited and seemed energetic and actually seemed like they were like engaged. That to me like worked really well. And then I'll just say when we go back to like specific problems that specific, if you think about Fedora, CentOS, and RHEL as one constituency that operates together as a thing, like whenever we do that, it feels like it works really well. But whenever we think about only our little problems in our space, then I feel like that's a different forum, basically in my mind. Those are my two thoughts.
Okay, thanks. Steve, go ahead.
I'll say that, actually getting together like this, I think, is working. And why I say that is I feel like even in those times where, say, it's a bit more quiet in this meeting, it still moves faster and gets more information back and forth than any other forum that we have. And I think that's just because we are in one space together. Otherwise, I fear some of the questions that people have raised, ourselves included, will get lost in a forum post or an email thread or a Jira ticket or something like that. So I do like that this exists, but it really does require us to raise questions, discuss in good faith, and try things and see what happens.
Neil, go ahead.
It's nice having all the people here, so there is that. But I think that's the only thing about it that has been working. I feel from my point of view, and some of the other folks, that I usually work with that are not here right now, probably because they're not awake yet because it's Pacific time. But I feel like it's one way. Concerns that are brought up by me or Davida or others don't actually matter and don't translate into something that results in some kind of problem solving or prioritization or anything. It doesn't actually seem to work, and despite repeated attempts to try to be like bring this up and make this important and talk about it, it drowns out in favor of essentially like, hey, what is the Red Hat flow of things, and what is their priorities, and what kind of cool product stuff they want, or how is their mindset of things. Like, there is the fundamental flaw I think we have right now is that there's no give and take. It doesn't feel like, it feels like we just have to kind of receive and adapt around it, and we don't really get an opportunity to influence in the other direction. And our problems are not important enough to result in any meaningful impact.
Yes, transparency is not enough. We actually want results that go with it. Scott?
Yeah, that's why I go back to when we find market problems that all three of us go after together, you totally have agency over that. But if you are going to live in a group that is 2/3, you're like think about this. There's 3 constituencies. Let's consider them all equal. There's Fedora, there's CentOS, and RHEL. One of them makes money and cares about money, of course, right? Like, of course, nobody would deny this. That one is, of course, going to have the strongest opinions about like a lot of things, right? Because when things make money, there's a lot more people involved, and it becomes like how to word this right? Like, most marriages end because of money problems, right? Like, this is a fact. We know this. Like, I think that's why that's why I keep trying to go back to, like, of course, no one's going to care about the problems that like one constituency has. Of course not. If there's 3 people, right? Like, if there's 3 equal people in this relationship, you have to get to like what we're fighting for, right? Like what we're all fighting for together, and what our shared, that would help us scope this call to like things that like all 3 groups care about. And so it will, of course, then be important for this call, right? Like, anything that's not in that scope is not for this call, and so is appropriately getting drowned out. Neil, to your point, like of course it's getting drowned out. Like, why would RHEL care about these things? Why would CentOS care about these things like that are happening in Fedora, and vice versa, right? Like, nobody in Fedora cares about the problems I have on my side, so I'm trying not to talk about them, because I know as a good citizen that you guys don't care about my pain internally and using Jira and things like that. Like, that's not your concerns. I could sit here for the entire call and talk about all kinds of pain I have as well, but nobody cares about it, and I understand that. I'm fully respectful of that.
Jeff?
Yeah, so my perspective, I'll turn my camera on so everyone can see the emotion on my face. So my perspective here is this, for me, is a discussion with one of my downstreams that materially benefits from the work that Fedora does, right? There are other downstreams. And so I fully expect this conversation is going to be biased towards what the interests are of that downstream. And I'm trying to manipulate that interest for the best benefit of the project. That is my goal, is to manipulate Red Hat, manipulate Scott specifically when he's here for the best benefit of the project. But there are other types of conversations like this I could be having with other downstreams. So from my perspective is for the people who are working inside the space of Fedora as a flat community space, do you want me doing this with other downstreams, right? Like, should I be doing this with Amazon because they have a derived product that is loosely based on Fedora, my understanding? Do you want me doing this with Universal Blue as a set of downstreams that have different interests from Red Hat, so that I can then find a way to get them to invest somehow time or something, manipulate them to invest in the project to the benefit of them and the project space, right? Like, so when Neil says he's coming at it because he works with people, you know, we all work in the Fedora space to some extent from a stakeholder standpoint, right? And my role from the Fedora leader's standpoint is I'm looking at this as one constituency that I need to make sure we have a way for them to benefit so they continue to invest in the project, right? I probably need to do the same thing patterned off of this with other constituents, right? I don't feel like this would be valuable as a thing if I brought all those constituents into the same discussion, because then we would not be having the discussion in the shape of that constituent's interests, right? So, because if I brought another vendor into this, would it be as useful? I don't think so, right? Because everybody's going to have different interests, and we need to make sure the project is aligned for multiple interests, right? So if this isn't the right place for Neil's concerns, because he doesn't feel like it's two-way, I sort of question maybe those concerns need a different avenue, right? So, because it's not clear that what he's talking about is something that RHEL, as a differentiated downstream, needs to care about, right? But there are conversations like, I know if I did this kind of thing with Universal Blue or Bazite or whatever, they would be talking specifically about the 32-bit issue that they have an interest in solving that Red Hat doesn't, but the Fedora project probably needs to solve if it's going to be a valuable upstream for them. And so I look at it from that point of view, where there are things that Fedora has to do so that it continues to be a valuable upstream for Red Hat as a constituent. And if we don't do those things, then it stops being a valuable upstream, and Red Hat doesn't have to participate in the project in the material way, right? And I want those kind of conversations for all the possible stakeholders out there, so I can close the loop better for everybody, right? So that's where I'm coming from on this. So from that perspective, it's helping me at least get alignment for this part of the ecosystem, right? But in a year there might be 4 of these meetings I have to do, so that I can increase alignment, and one of those might be something involving Neil more directly to the interests he's working on. I don't know. I'm just saying that's how I'm looking at it.
Okay, so Neil, I see your hands up, but I just want to interject really quick. 2 things. One, I want to remind everybody, let's share the mic. We have finite time and a large body of people. So if everyone spent 5 minutes chatting, we would be here for 90 minutes. So we want to be as succinct as we can, even me, and I'm not good at it. So we all need practice. And then also, Neil's got his hand up. Neil does a lot of the talking because Neil speaks on behalf of other people because they don't speak up for themselves. I think one thing that we should endeavor to do is don't make Neil speak for you. Speak for yourself so that Neil can have a break. It's a big burden to bear. So with that, Neil, go ahead.
Yeah. So a lot of the things that I work on that I bring up are not actually, almost all the things I bring up that in this space are not for me. My own problems, I just solve for myself and I don't tell anyone. They don't matter. Problems for other people is what I tend to bring up here. So this is to reinforce Brennan's point. I very, very, very rarely bring up problems for myself to a broader audience. They don't matter. I have made my peace with that fact. But problems for larger groups of people, Fedora community, CentOS, the SIGs and whatever, like other stakeholders that are trying to participate in this space in a meaningful way, that is generally who I'm speaking for when I'm coming in hot into this. Like most recently, ELN hyperscale is probably dead in the water because we can't actually find a path to integrate what we need into ELN because the kernel package is not a community-controlled resource. It's a Red Hat controlled one. And so we can't actually influence it despite the fact that it's a Fedora space because the project is ultimately controlled by RHEL and they don't actually want non-Red Hatters to be involved in it at all. So that's a huge problem. And this is just one example. There are lots of little examples throughout the Fedora space where functionally me as an outsider, I have no ability to fix anything. And I have to beg you to care to fix it. And this is the point blunt truth of the whole reason I'm even here. Because otherwise, there's not a lot for me to do in this meeting or to participate in.
Go ahead, Scott.
I totally want to understand, Neil, that like I am sympathetic to the pain you feel on all this, and I am sympathetic to anybody else that feels pain. But like, we tried to get this group together to like figure out what. It is not a forum to like escalate problems. Like as a product manager, I can't even help you with this stuff. Like I have no idea. Like I wear a Red Hat badge, and I feel like I'm like. There's a lot of Red Hatters on here, but somehow I feel this guilt that like I'm sort of the PM of last resort in RHEL, and like planning RHEL 11 puts me with a really wide purview, but it is not like how things get done, right? Like my purview is not to mandate how things get done. It is purely to like figure out which business problems we solve. And yeah, of course, I'm a fairly technical human being, so I help a little bit with that, but like I cannot possibly be that final like person that basically catches every problem in Fedora and CentOS. Like I am not that human being. Like I'm
not asking you to be clear. Yeah. I'm not asking you to be those things.
Fair. Okay. Because I feel guilty every time I hear your problems. I just have to say this out loud. Like I do feel guilty.
To be clear, the reason that I'm here is because the original reason this meeting was created was because we were literally suffering in CentOS in Fedora about very specific problems, and we had no way to make anyone notice that they mattered. Like the one that was the most poignant was our secure boot problems that were affecting both CentOS and Fedora. And it was so serious that we couldn't get anyone to care for 2 years. That is what drove the creation of this group in the first place, was because we really don't have a way to talk to the right people at all to influence anything or to get them to notice that we are suffering.
Yeah, so I have to figure out who is the Red Hat person on this call that handles that, because it's not me. I'm tapping out. I just need to say that.
I mean, to be clear, the stuff that you bring up is also useful and helpful, right? Like you bring up interesting things and whatever. But I'm saying like the stuff I need to bring up to a leadership context are the things that all the other people that work with me or are below me don't have a voice for, and you guys even slightly care about what I say because you all know me. Otherwise, you wouldn't care what I say either.
Yeah, I do care, actually. Yeah, I agree.
It's not just that we know you, Neil. It's that you have a leadership standing in the community space that is like you are here because of that. Like you're explicitly here because of that, not because you asked for it, but because we asked you to be here. So just Steph put a question in the chat, which I'm going to summarize as: Has the topic of a separate kernel for an ELN hyperscale SIG ever been raised here? And I don't think the answer is yes. I think the idea of an ELN hyperscale SIG has been mentioned in passing here, but we have never in this body talked about that intentionally. And that is exactly the kind of thing I'm interested in talking about. And it also just so happens that Steph is the manager where ELN, CentOS, and Fedora all kind of meet up as far as engineering accountability goes. And so we are very well positioned to have conversations about that here, if somebody will but put it on the agenda. Amy, go ahead.
Okay, so I'm going to take this back to the secure boot issue, and that was discussed in the room in Boston. And I will admit, I intentionally invited people that could talk about that issue to the room. Maybe we haven't done that as good here. But I'm a big proponent of sometimes you just need to get people in a room to talk. And virtual doesn't accomplish what you can in a real room. That's it.
Okay, so just for the sake of like the ongoing purpose here, Neil, could I ask you to add a topic for this that we could include in the agenda in a few weeks' time? We could bring all the right people here and talk about what we want to do. Because the thing that makes CentOS so awesome with its SIGs is that we can override packages. The thing that makes ELN so great is you get like the next RHEL experience using rawhide effectively. But Fedora SIGs don't have that thing. CentOS SIGs do. And ELN sits in that uncomfortable middle spot. And that, to me, means that it is highly negotiable what can and can't happen. So, Neil, if you're talking, you're on mute.
I'm not talking, I'm typing.
Okay. There is a second conversation taking place in the Gmeet chat. Steve, go ahead.
So I just want to ask this question then. Like, it sounds like the perception or the reality or both is that the general conversation is what Red Hat or RHEL or whatever is doing and kind of propagating that outwards. And it doesn't feel like, or in reality, that the same thing is respected in the other direction. Neil, since you were vocal about it, I want to ask you, like, what would it look like if that was to change? Like, what would that actually look like? Because I think maybe that's an area that we're not quite grasping, is we think we're providing this, but maybe we are not.
I mean, so let me use a concrete example as a way to describe what I expected. So way back in December, we had a conversation about the Nvidia driver stack. It was something all three of us cared about. And I pointed out there are a lot of technical and other resourcing problems that we have to deal with. It was like I'd already started working on parts of those technical problems, and I'd actually essentially forked a bunch of stuff in Alma Linux to resolve them in the short term over there. And I wanted to, solve it more broadly. And I was like, oh yeah, cool, that's great. Like, let's do this. So like I created the Jira ticket during the meeting. I made the required pull requests and tagged all the people into it and asked them to like link this up, make this important. Like Scott was excited about it and all this other stuff. And then bupkis. And so no feedback, no response, despite pings or whatever. Even when the AIE SIG got created in CentOS, still nothing. And I brought it up even there with those people. And it's just like, well, I don't know what I'm supposed to do, even for things everyone cares about. This is why I feel like nothing is working, because if it is brought up by me, no one does anything. If it is brought up by Steph or Scott, then stuff happens. Even if it affects everybody.
Get our people to mobilize on it. And if you have very few people that you are directing, then of course you will have less people to do the thing that you ask them to do. So this is all of us bringing our ability to execute into this form. You may bring less ability, and I bring maybe more. Maybe Scott brings a certain amount, Brendan brings a certain amount, Carl, Vishek, you all bring in one way or another, whether through direct or indirect leadership, your ability to execute. And of course, I shouldn't expect to go and tell the folks that you're leading what to do. So of course, these are different weights. Like, you shouldn't be able to tell everyone here what to do, but together we can each bring the resources that we have to bear when we believe that it's needed.
I had my hand up, and yeah, I have One, I'm pretty sympathetic to what Neil feels on this one, like even more so than the other things. Like, I was excited about this one. I still am. So I do wonder, like, where did this fall apart? Like, okay, let me explain it from my side. So I am sort of the PM that looks at all the major business problems that we're solving in RHEL. And then I mostly delegate to people, to be honest with you. I'm a politician. Like, I go, hey, Scott Harold is working on Project Voyager with the Nvidia team. What, Neil, you just mentioned sounds like, because I'm kind of, again, a politician, I hear certain buzzwords and I go, oh, he said things about, in fact, I forget the words that you said, but you said a couple buzzwords in my mind that went, Scott Harold, Project Nvidia stuff, like, are they talking? That's immediately what I thought to my brain. And I immediately thought, like, how do I get that group of people talking? And then I don't know where it fell down. Like, I don't know if that team looked at it, decided it wasn't important, and then didn't communicate that back to you, or, you know, you're right. There was definitely a failure in communication there somehow. I don't know how. We got to dig into that. That's probably something we should do offline. But yeah, that is one where I feel like there should be better feedback. You should at least understand. It shouldn't just die in Jira, to Steve's point. Like, dying in Jira is not the right way. I know that much. We got to figure out, like, what is the feedback loop there? Like, at least a definitive no or a yes would be at a minimum what I would expect there. So yeah, Neil, I mean,
that would have been even better than what I got, which was just waiting in hell, trying to figure out what's going on.
Yeah, I'm super sympathetic to this one. Let's touch base on where that died, because admittedly, here's one of the other challenges. I don't know all the technical details of how you guys interact and pull requests to this thing. There's a lot of details in here that I do not fully understand, but I know that, like, right now, that team that is on the Nvidia partnership stuff is deep down in that world. So they would know that. I just got to figure out where the wires didn't connect, or did they connect and then just somebody didn't decide it was important, or I don't know what happened. You know, that's the problem.
I mean, I don't know either, but, like, so that was that particular thing was my canary to see whether this process works when there's something mutually beneficial for everybody. And if that doesn't work, I can't expect anything to work. So, like, I'm not saying that, okay, things that are only Fedora, I expect all of FRCL to give a crap about. It would be nice if they cared, because, like, Fedora is the upstream and everything we do actually does influence everyone else. But I have learned over the past 15 years that is the default is no, we don't care. So I am already fine with that. I've made my peace with that. But when people outright tell me that everyone cares about this and would like to see me contribute my fixes and whatever to make it better in all three spaces, and then I go and do it, and then nobody does anything, that's a waste of my time.
My promise to you on this one, Neil, is I will go and I'll talk to Scott and Shelley. She's the program manager, and I will say, hey, did anybody see? Can you just send me a link to whatever the highest level thing that connects to all the things that you're talking about is, and if I can send that to them and, like, make sure, I will promise you I'll at least get human beings to look at it.
Okay, so Neil, I want to check something because I ran down the RHEL issue that you linked yesterday. So is this specifically about RHEL-133403?
Yep.
Okay. So there are three ways that this could have gone a whole lot better, and I'm going to do them in no particular order. The first way is that, and here's a link for the people who are curious about it. So the first way is, like, Neil did the work, and that is awesome, and he filed the issue, and that is awesome. He did not say, however, I'm really hoping I can get this into 10.2. Do you think that's possible? Or something along those lines. He did
the metadata for the ticket.
Yeah, and at the same time, the team who received the ticket, they took it in, they triaged it, and by the time it got there, it was not in their 10.2 plans. They didn't understand that there was any urgency to it. And actually, this is not inside Steph's team. This is inside the curl maintainers team, completely different organization, because it's not a driver issue. It's like a packaging issue. So it happens elsewhere in the org. There's no reason any of us would know that, though. And so, like, the ticket did not in plain text say, this is what I'm hoping for. The team that triaged it did not say, hey, this is what we're planning on doing with it. But in both cases, there was no connection between this ticket being filed and any of us talking about this topic. So one way we can prevent this from happening in the future is anytime we end up creating an issue as a result of a FRCL call, if you link it into the epic for the discussion, then suddenly it becomes my problem to close out and make sure things happen. So that is not a thing that we've been explicit about before. That's a thing I'd like to be explicit about from this point forward. If you want results here, if we want more than information sharing, if you want things to actually happen, and for accountability to take place, we need to actually connect up what we talk about here with the follow-ups. And the best way to do that is just put issues in the epic, because then there's a built-in accountability mechanism. We never talked about that before. It's never been explicit, but I'd like to make that explicit from this point forward. Alexandra, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just thinking, as a product owner, I want to comment on this metadata issue thing, because like it's basically my thing, and one of my responsibilities at work is to care about Jira metadata. But I'm going to be like really open and honest, and I hope this is a safe space where I can be that person. It's like, most of my tickets have wrong metadata, or like some of the metadata is wrong with them, or there's like some outdated metadata value, or there is some other thing which is happening with metadata stuff. So I appreciate your hope that our processes and everything is set up in the way that like the setting up a correct metadata field solves all the problems. But if we're being honest, it is not how it works. So I do appreciate whenever you work with the tickets, do kind of count in human error and things like this, and do add a comment, do explain the use case, do explain the expectations or importance or severity, because yeah, there are like different reasons why severity field can be filled for a Jira issue in different ways, and it's not always clear for a product owner, even who is like me, is like, it's my job. I still have problems sometimes with this. And same with fixed version, it's not always correct, as I mentioned elsewhere. And same with release expectations, with planning and so on. So the more explicit you are about your needs, the more help you most likely will get on these issues as well.
Would it be fair to say that the processes in Fedora are generally well defined, and the processes as you get closer towards product become more discussion, human, say words versus like, this is what you do to get this result? Or am I misthinking about these things?
I think the depth of RHEL planning is so much bigger. Like Fedora has one upcoming release and one release which will become end of life and rawhide. RHEL has 10 different branches, 10 different loops of a planning. So I have like RHEL 11 planning, I have RHEL 10.3 planning, I have RHEL 9 planning and stuff like this. So there's so many contexts. So yeah, we use all this metadata in Jira to help us navigate those contexts, but there's just like so many of them. And I think that people from a community, this is also which we had during the CentOS stream times, like people very, we underestimate a lot how tracking things between minor branches of RHEL brings so much levels of visibility issues, complexity, tracking issues, and so on. So we're like constantly fighting and trying to build better processes on this, but like Fedora is lucky. Fedora has just like one branch at a single time. This is so nice, but like RHEL planning is a big mess. And whatever we do, if we just try to help each other with that, this just like adds to success for everyone else. Like from the reporter side, from the product owner side, we all try to show a little bit of human attention when we're doing that, because yes, partner relationship helps, personal relationship helps, everything helps.
Brian, go ahead.
Yeah, I think to add to that, I don't think there's a way that we can give a set of magic words that would affect a result, but having the conversation is the really important part, because it's not just the different branches that are involved, but the different priority levels among different issues. And it's not it's not the requester's job to figure out how to say which priority level that fits in. It's the PO's job to ease that out of the conversation. And that's why it's so important to start with a chat. Even if you're coming with, proposed merge requests and the work's already done and it seems like it's such a simple issue, starting with the conversation with the people who prioritize things, that will help them actually slot it into the right spot. So that's my 2 cents.
And I just want to recognize on the sidebar, Carl has one understanding of what the target version field is for. I think the sad reality is that all those meta fields are inconsistently applied across the organization. Sometimes they indicate intent, sometimes they indicate a request. Never do they indicate agreement. Or if they do, it's like a broken clock being right twice a day. So it is imperfect and it is messy, but a conversation is the only way you can advance things and know that they've advanced. And I'm sorry, Neil, because I understand that the technical work is like the thing that needs to be done for the action to be possible. But I think for prioritization purposes, we need conversation as well to get anything like realistic expectations for inclusion. Scott, go ahead.
Huge +1 on the communication thing. So I pinged Scott Harold. This is a recorded call. He is the PM lead for like the Nvidia stuff, and I think this touches that the most closely. Interestingly, he said there's not enough context for me to give an opinion in that Jira. That was his response to me. I must make that public. So Neil, might I beg you, like when you add these things, like explaining what it is and why it's important would also help, because it's very jarring. It's very jarring when you just get some like Jira and you're like, I don't know why this is important, and you're trying to triage it in your mind to like even understand, is this something I care about? The more we can do that, the better. And I hate to say the word AI, but it really does help with this. Like it really does. Like I have it tear through my email and I will literally have it write up 2 paragraph backgrounds now of like why something's important or whatever. And it is actually quite good at doing all that work that I am not good at doing, because emotionally it's very tiring to like add all that background to emails and things. Like I'll just have it generate that and then I will copy paste it and read it. And might I beg you, that is my only advice on this call.
Yeah, I think there's 2 things here. I think what you said, Scott, is correct, but I also agree that, and I think we all agree on this. It would have been nicer if there would have been a response on it last year when it came in. That would have been helpful too, even if it was, hey, could you give me more context? I don't understand.
I agree. In fact,
but those things together, yeah.
Hey, yeah. Scott, could you ask for the context? It's like, why am I?
So it's both.
Yeah,
yes,
exactly.
Yeah.
That was my response back to him, by the way. Yeah. Funny that we came to the exact same conclusion.
Yeah. So Brian, are you the chief product owner these days? I'm not sure what titles we're using at the moment, but this seems like a PO problem at some level, right?
Yeah, it's definitely something that we're talking about as a practice.
Okay. So maybe there is a follow-up there to talk about the standard of triage.
I will also point out there's not actually a way to have a conversation with people before actually starting these ticket things. So if you're asking for conversations, that's basically a non-starter for anyone who's outside of the Red Hat product sphere.
Yeah, you have the conversation in the ticket. Like
Yeah.
Ticket that no one talks in.
What was that? I missed that, Neil.
The ticket that nobody talks in, right? Like, why should I put in more stuff if no one reads them? Like,
so I think
that is the general.
Is...
Like every single ticket I've filed in the Red Hat Jira, I have had to go and poke with side channels to get anyone to read them. If that is the expectation, I am not going to invest more time into writing more detailed tickets because it ain't worth it.
I think starting with the description is the important part, because that is what folks read when they first come in. So like treat that like the opening of a conversation with a human being on the other side, because that's that's what they look at when as part of the triage process, and trying to slot that in with the rest of the priorities there.
Alexander, can I make a quick response to that too? Neil, I must confess that that is how everyone feels when they file things in Jira, including me. Everyone feels the feeling you're feeling. It's natural. Everyone is overwhelmed by Jira tickets and Slack messages and blah, blah, blah. This is just the world we live in. I hate to say it. And even me, I have to go call to call. The only difference is I can actually put 30 minutes on people's calendars and make them pay attention to me. But yeah, we all feel that feeling.
Again, as a practicing PO, I would say in my team, we do have bug triage procedures. So we have a weekly setup of where we review all the tickets updated in the last couple of weeks and to see if they need a comment or if we need to react immediately or something. But it does help if you, when we say start conversations, like add comment to a ticket, because one notification about a ticket can fall through. One ticket can slip through the filters by some reason, whatever. If you leave a comment, that's doubles your chances. So on one hand, I would say, yes, personal context is important. On the other, like we actually care about Jira. We read the Jira tickets. There are some mistakes which may happen, but we do have all certain processes to try not to forget about Jira tickets. So it's not a waste of time. It's not something completely unreasonable. And thank you for filing them. But yeah, pinging, like leaving a comment, helping people to get your notification of the same issue can resolve some situations where people are on PTO and they forgot that one single notification, which was about the ticket being created and first appearing in the queue. Sometimes these things just get lost in the processes.
Honestly, I need proof that it's actually worth my time to go back to writing larger descriptions, because I used to and I stopped because it didn't do anything.
I mean,
2 sentences.
What kind of proof do you want? Do you want me to sign a letter? Because like I am a PO who read the tickets which come to my project, and yes, I care. Like the more context you give, the more reproducers you give, the faster we're to make a decision. And usually, it even like when we have a very ticket which we do not know how to even interpret, we cannot even reply to it, because to reply to it, I need to interpret it. So I put it on the log. Thankfully, right now I have a very like reliable QE folks, and whenever we get this ticket, they are really fast in going and like actually playing with the system, with their hands-on experience and verifying trying to guess better what the customer is talking about in that issue. But this is time consuming. This is not always easy. The QE folks have a lot of other stuff to do and so on. So that's definitely, even to get a first reply of like, no, we cannot do it, or yes, we can consider it in next year, or no. This is where the context already matters, and the faster we get to it through our means or through your means, the easier the communication is for this stuff.
Go ahead, Steve.
I agree with what everyone is saying. However, I don't think that we can ask people who are contributing to our success to make Jira tickets harder, like put more information and just submit that ticket or that code harder so that we respond. I know that we're not saying that, we're not trying to say that, but that is kind of how I would interpret this if I was in Neil's shoes, was thank you for your contribution, but you need to do better for us to make this into, you know, our ecosystem. I think what we should be doing is saying that, yeah, this was a mutual accident in terms of how this card played out. We can do better. You know, we as the broader folks here in general. It could be a more full of context ticket, but just as much, it can be acknowledged that it was received and in review, or that we're aware of it and we need more information, or anything like that. And we can coach Neil and others of like how we would like to see the tickets. I think that's totally fine. But I think we need to stop putting the onus so far on those working with us. Otherwise, we're going to have less people working with us, because why jump over that hoop if, you know, it's not mutually helpful in those cases? So I'm not trying to like disagree with anybody, because I think we all made great points. I'm just, I worry that if we set that so high at the community level and it's lower or as high within the we know each other level, that the results are, it's going to be a smaller and smaller group of people working towards common issues. Go ahead.
I very much agree with you, Steve. That definitely makes sense to me. I cannot deny that. Like, I was going to try to offer constructive. I feel the pain on both sides of this percent, and I agree with you. You'll end up shrinking the community base if you don't respond. On the flip side, I will also say I know that, like, from being on the other side of these things, that like it is very difficult for the person on the outside to see how much work got generated on the other side, because a lot of time there's no response, but yet people are moving and talking and jitters happening on the back end. It's just, it's not obvious to the person that they generated a bunch of jitter. And so there is this like strange disconnect. Ticket systems are just hard. That said, like, one of the experiences I've had recently, and again, not to be the business guy that brings up AI, I don't want to be don't kick me, please. But like, I will say one of the more pleasant experiences I've had is when I submit PRs, is when like Gemini Code Assistant, for example, will auto respond within 5 minutes and tell me like, what did I do wrong? And like guide me through like what I needed to do to make it better. That's kind of a pleasant experience. Like something akin to that. Like, it does feel possible that we could have, Alexandra, like in your team, like some set of, I hate to say the word again, I know these are all buzzwords, but some sort of constitution that says what we need to like fully triage and understand this thing. And an agent could automatically respond, say, here's what we need to know, like, so that we can triage this and figure out, is this even our thing? Much less, is it a priority? Much less, like, who do we got to involve? Like, it does feel like we could automate some of that so that this experience is more pleasant on both sides. Like, it does feel so possible to do that. Okay, that's my last pitch for AI. I will stop. I know that I will get kicked if I say that word too much.
Alexandra, and I'm going to close this out.
Yeah, I'm sorry. It sounded that way, that we're need put blame on the reporter. Like, I honestly just wanted to reply to, does it matter if you put more context? Yes, it does create a huge difference. Is it like your job to put all the context we need? No, it's not your job to put all the context we need. It's part of our job to go and figure out some context when we need it. We will definitely work on that. And as I said, like, my team has triage procedures. Not all the teams where I worked with Red Hat had this reliable triage procedures, and this is something which we maybe need to raise a priority for, and so on. So that there is definitely some kind of triage process which every single SST in RHEL implements. This would be an interesting follow-up for internal RHEL conversation from this thing. So yeah, and also, thank you for trying to work with us. This actually does make our life better, and hopefully everyone else's as well.
Absolutely. So we are at the top of the hour. Here's what you can expect. Next week, we're going to talk about CRA and how it relates to Fedora. Week after that, we'll do sandboxes part 2. We've got some examples to share where we think sandboxes are the answer. And in the meanwhile, I'm going to set up a poll in the Freckle chat for meeting time, because we're consistently not having enough time. And I'd like us to decide if that's because we need to have like rules for how we use the time, or if we need more time but we meet less frequently. And then also, is this the right time, like toggling back and forth the way we are? So I'll see you in the Freckle chat. And for the things we talked about today, you can expect a very small document for what I think the rules of the road are for Freckle that I will ask you to review, modify, and otherwise practice. So you should expect that in the next few days, actually. So thanks for the discussion today, everybody. And Neil, again, thank you for all your contributions. I know that it's not smooth, but I think with your feedback and persistence, we get better. And I think open source gets better when we adapt to the feedback we get from one another. So let's keep talking. I'll see y'all later.
Bye, y'all.